In a few somewhat recent videos, we took an in-depth look at two parts of the core worlds, the Arrowhead and the Southern Core. The core worlds are generally known as the wealthiest and most prestigious part of the Star Wars galaxy, but as we discussed in those two videos, that stereotype only really applies to part of the core. Other parts of the region were more complex, although they were generally still well off on average. But in this video, we're going to be looking at two coreward regions that completely defied everything you'd expect from the core. One that you've probably heard of and one that you probably haven't. One of these regions, the Deep Core, was little explored and mysterious, despite its close proximity to the heart of the Republic, while the other region, the Negative Regions, was a backwater stretch of the core worlds that was as poor and obscure as many parts of the Outer Rim. Today, we'll be examining both of these regions in extreme depth, covering their history and the systems and species that lay within them.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Before we begin, the same ground rules for our previous region tours will apply for this video. We're not going to mention every single system in the Deep Core or the Negs by name, but we'll at least mention all the interesting systems as well as trade routes, the relationships between various local civilizations, and also how the regions fared during the Clone Wars. With that out of the way, let's get into things, starting with a look at the Negative Regions. The Negative Regions, more commonly known as the Negs, were a strip of the northern core worlds, colonies, and inner rim that ran along the borders of the unknown regions. They were so named because they were located west of Coruscant, which was the center of the galactic coordinate system, and this meant that their hyperspace coordinates all started with a negative digit. A negative first digit was a bit of a mark of shame in the Star Wars galaxy, as systems that far west were generally little known backwaters. The Negs themselves weren't the only region located west of Coruscant, but they were definitely the region that got looked down upon the most for it. The Negs were bounded by the edge of the Deep Core to the south, by the unknown regions to the west, and by the border between the Inner Rim and Expansion region to the north. To the east, the Negs were bordered by the Koros Trunk Line in the south and the Namadii Corridor in the north, but neither route was considered part of the Negs. The Koros Trunk Line and its neighboring systems were part of the Arrowhead, while the Namadii Corridor was the western backbone of the northern dependencies. The Negs started west of a small buffer zone adjacent to each route, with the exact border being a little hazy. Although the Negs stretched across the core, colonies, and inner rim, the vast majority of explored territory within the region was in the core worlds, although the systems there were considered core worlds in name only, treated as perpetually second class by the rest of the region. Economically, culturally, and politically, the Negs were more suited to the rim than the core. The average Negative Region system was a middle income at best, little known, and had very little influence of any sort, although there were some exceptions to this rule. Very little trade or travel passed through the Negs, and they were arguably the least strategically important part of the galaxy as well. The reason why the Negs were so dismal was fairly simple. The region was defined primarily by tens of thousands of years of disappointment and failed exploration. In the very first decades of the Republic's history, scouts from the core worlds found two great hyperspace routes, the Polemian Trade Route and the Corellian Run, which stretched far into the rim, allowing the Republic to expand rapidly into the region between. The Republic sought to find a similar super hyper route leading out into the galaxy's western half, and in 20,000 BBY, it found a promising candidate, the Metellos Trade Route. But expansion of the Metellos Trade Route quickly stalled as hyperspace scouts came up against the anomalies and navigational hazards on the edge of the unknown regions. The route continued to expand, but at an agonizingly slow pace, no more than a few light years every century. No other major routes west of Coruscant were discovered, and the Republic's hope of finding a new super route west died. The region that the Metellos trade route was supposed to open up to a wave of trade and settlement became an irrelevant backwater, disparaged as the Negs, and treated as a lost cause by Republic business interests. By 15,000 BBY, 5,000 years after the blazing of the Metellos trade route began, the route was still quite short, and only a small pocket of territory around it had been explored. From 8,000 to 1,000 BBY, Republic scouts steadily mapped out more of the Negs, pushing out from the Namadii corridor and the slowly lengthening Metellos trade route. But progress was slow, and discoveries remained minor. During the Republic's final centuries, from 1000 to 25 BBY, expansion picked up a little, but not enough to reinvigorate the region, which remained a little visited backwater. The Negs were defined by two major hyperspace routes, both of which we've already mentioned, the Namadii corridor and the Metellos trade route. The Namadii corridor, as we said earlier, wasn't located in the Negs at all, but the parts of the region in the inner rim, colonies, and outer part of the core were defined by it, linked to the rest of the galaxy by the Namadii corridor's minor spurs. The Metellos trade route, meanwhile, was the most significant route within the Negs themselves, and it formed the backbone of the Negs' most populated region, connecting the Negs' distant territories to civilization. The Metellos trade route started at Koornacht and wrapped around the deep core to the Koornacht cluster on the far side, where it terminated at Oroturu near Nzoth. The only other major route in the Negs was the Ag Circuit, essentially a branch of the Metellos trade route that linked the Negs' few prosperous worlds to the Arrowhead. Now, let's talk about the various systems of the negative regions, starting with the innermost part of the territory, the strip of systems along the Metellos trade route, which we'll go through from east to west. The eastern stretch of this region was decently well settled and typically better off than the rest of the Negs, and it had, long ago, been thoroughly integrated into the Republic. This region was dominated by the Metellos for the most part, although there were a few other prominent local powers as well. This part of the Negs actually included the westernmost part of the Koornacht sector, where the most prominent and densely populated planet in the Negs was located, Metellos itself. Metellos was located just west of Koornacht along the Metellos trade route, and was one of the oldest human colonies in the galaxy, settled via sleeper ship circa 27,000 BBY. Metellos was a prominent planet in the early Republic, but it quickly lost most of its prestige and economic power to Koornacht. Apart from a few sewage-choked seas and uninhabitable desert regions, Metellos was fully urbanized, covered by enormous city blocks which were run down, polluted, and severely overpopulated. More than 900 billion people, mostly humans, were crammed into Metellos' city districts, and the vast majority of them were desperately poor, with the planet's wealthy gentry living in floating cities high in Metellos' skies. Metellos was run by a corporate bureaucracy, which gave business interests a free hand to strip mine the planet and dump trash in its orbit, where there was so much debris that it formed a ring system. Disparagingly known as the Koornacht that wasn't, and many other such nicknames, Metellos was an absolute mess of a planet. The rulers of Metellos initially hoped that exploration of the Negs would solve the planet's problems, giving the Metellos room to spread out and making Metellos a hub of trade. They poured piles of credits into exploration of the Metellos trade route and covered Metellos 3, one of the planet's airless moons, with long-range telescopes to hunt for potential colonies, but these efforts failed. Metellos remained nothing more than Koornacht's dysfunctional neighbor, and although it was the economic and political core of the Negs, that wasn't saying much. West of Metellos itself, the Metellos trade route ran out to Volgax, a humid, mountainous world home to a long-extinct alien civilization, and Aland, a military shipbuilding world home to the Aland Yards. During the old Sith Wars, Volgax was also home to the headquarters and combat arenas of a brutal slaving organization known as the Crucible, which also occupied the nearby planet of Sardia. once home to the secret Mandalorian-run New Generation Academy, which studied Force-sensitive children. Just off this leg of the Metellos trade route were several rundown urban worlds, including Norn and Koornacht, the latter of which was formerly home to the arms manufacturer Koornacht Weapon Works before descending into anarchy and planet-wide gang wars. The icy planet Ensolika was home to the cold-adapted near-human Enso, the undisputed masters of hydroponic technology who were a minor regional power, while neighboring Grana hosted another near-human species, the Granans. Other planets located just off the route included Ondos, the long-lost home of an ancient sect of Force users, Jevelet, which housed a Republic mental institution for dangerously insane criminals, and Canastra 4, a world of shallow oceans home to the non-sentient, multi-brained, two-headed Tortuque, which were considered a delicacy across the core and regularly hunted by poachers. In the eastern Negs, the Ag circuit ran parallel to the Metellos trade route, running along the edge of the deep core on its way east into the Arrowhead. As we discussed in our video on the Arrowhead, the agricultural circuit was a popular hyperspace route that connected a string of 18 factory farm planets owned by the Salish Agricultural Corporation. Salish Ag provided Coruscant with most of its food, and although most of its agri-worlds were located on the Arrowhead stretch of the route, the part of the Ag circuit in the Negs had some prominent systems as well, including the wealthiest worlds in the negative regions. Among the Ag circuit worlds were Stasia, one of the Salish Ag farm worlds, and Salish itself, another agri-world and headquarters of Salish Ag, which made it one of the wealthiest planets in the Negs. The western end of the Ag circuit was located in the Toranic sector, where it passed Warudu, an agri-world known for its handcrafted baskets, and Garland, the homeworld of the near-human Galandans, a planet ringed by endless equatorial roads and the birthplace of the Hakig religion. Past Garland was Fresia, the oceanic, island-dotted headquarters of the Incom Corporation, which designed the Z-95 Headhunter, ARC-170, and T-65 X-Wing, prototypes of which were designed, built, and tested on Fresia. Fresia was the site of a key battle early in the Galactic Civil War, in which the Rebel Alliance acquired its first squadron of X-Wings. Past Fresia, the Ag circuit met the Metellos trade route at Cal-Seti, a planet home to a few major spaceports, including an Imperial military docking facility. Past Cal-Seti, the Metellos trade route plunged into the farthest and most obscure reaches of the Negs. Here, on the far side of the deep core, was a small but surprisingly dense knot of sectors which were little populated but had plenty of interesting secrets. After passing a few remote outposts of civilization, such as the Tarak spaceport colony Utharis, the route entered the Farlak sector where it met its end. The Farlak sector, together with the neighboring Hatawa sector, contained more than 200 inhabited systems, more than 2/3 of which were unaffiliated with the Republic. Among these were Norat, which had its own sentient species of the same name, and Orutaru, the homeworld of a purple hut-like species. Orutaru was the official endpoint of the Metellos trade route, but there was a little-used continuation of the route, the Wydek bypass, which went onto the planet Wydek at the far end of the Farlak sector. Along the way, the bypass went by Wetum, home to an eponymous sentient species, as well as Galantos, a low-gravity, chromite-rich planet covered in seas of organic gelatin, which were home to the Fia, Galantos' native sentience. The Wydek bypass wrapped around the Koornacht cluster, a large and extremely dense cluster of approximately 2,000 stars, plus thick clouds of gas and dust. Many of these star systems were lifeless, however, and the sheer density of stars in the cluster made it difficult to navigate. Republic explorers were only ever able to penetrate the outermost reaches of the Koornacht cluster. It wasn't until the time of the Empire that outside explorers managed to map the cluster's inner worlds. the Empire opened up the region for colonization, and a number of habitable worlds in the Koornacht cluster were claimed by settlers from all over the galaxy. These included the arid Granin colony of Polnai, the Kubaz colony of Morning Bell, the Koornacht colony of Dornick 207, and the Bridgian chromite mining colony of New Bridgia. The Morath established 2 mining colonies in the cluster, Kojash and Elkorth, while the Empire established factory farming operations on Kutag and Pirol 5. A group of Galandan adherents of the Hakig religion built a major shrine, the Temple of the Infinite Spirit, on another world in the cluster, the temperate planet Ghetto. But while most of the Koornacht cluster worlds were originally uninhabited, this wasn't the case for all of them. The arid planet Enzoth was the homeworld of the sentient Yevotha, a gaunt humanoid species distinguished by sharp, foot-long wrist claws. The Yevotha were highly intelligent but also ruthless, bloodthirsty, and they were arguably the most xenophobic species in the galaxy, a trait owed to a quirk of their history. The sheer density and brightness of the stars of the Koornacht cluster meant that the rest of the galaxy wasn't visible from Enzoth's skies, which led the Yevotha to believe that the cluster was all there was in the universe. They also believed that they were the only intelligent life forms in the universe, a belief they felt was confirmed after they began colonizing other planets and found only non-sentient life on them. During the Republic's final centuries, the Yevotha colonized 12 such planets beyond Enzoth, including Fuz, Tholaz, Tyzon, Wakizar, Zephyl, and Jina, which were governed by the Yevotha Protectorate. The Republic never made contact with the Yevotha, but the Empire did, and the Yevotha were not at all pleased to discover that they weren't alone in the universe, considering the very existence of other sentient beings to be blasphemous. But the Empire was far more powerful than the Yevotha, and it quickly conquered the entire Yevotha Protectorate. The Empire's Black Sword Command decided to turn the Koornacht cluster into a fortress, building shipyards and hiding large fleets above the conquered Yevotha worlds. The Yevotha were enslaved and forced to work in these shipyards, of which there were at least 15 across the Koornacht cluster. These included Black 8 over Wazika, Black 9 over the gas giants Prildaz, Black 11 over Jina, and Black 15 over Enzoth itself. One of Enzoth's moons, Pa'al, also hosted an Imperial garrison base. 8 months after the Battle of Endor, however, the Yevotha rose up against the Empire, and they successfully captured not only the Imperial shipyards, but also 44 capital ships, including 3 Super Star Destroyers. The Yevotha's new government, the Duskan League, used this fleet to carry out the Yevothan Purge, a genocidal crusade against the outsiders in the Koornacht cluster. Years of Imperial oppression had done nothing to change the Yevotha's xenophobic views, and rather than accept they had been wrong about being the only sentient life in the universe, they decided to go forth and make this belief a reality. In 16 ABY, with the power of the Black Fleet at their disposal, the Yevotha swept across the Koornacht cluster, wiping out the entire populations of Polnai, Morning Bell, Dornick 207, New Bridgia, Elkorth, Kojash, Kutag, and Pirol 5. The Yevotha spared no one, and they soon moved beyond the Koornacht cluster, depopulating Norat and harassing Galantos and Jitapatan. Fortunately, the New Republic intervened to stop the Duskan League, which was ultimately defeated and disarmed. Years later, during the Yuuzhan Vong War, the Vong, on the urging of the Yevotha's former victims, destroyed Enzoth via orbital bombardment, wiped out the other Yevotha colonies, and hunted the survivors across the Koornacht cluster. Despite this, the Yevotha refused any kind of outside help. The last known Yevotha, a pilot fighting in his people's last battle against the Vong, chose to die rather than accept New Republic assistance. There were a few other remote sectors in the Negs beyond the Farlak sector, including the Hatawa sector, which the Koornacht cluster spilled over into. This sector contained the Morath Nebula, where the homeworld of the Morath was located, as well as the Marai, a group of planets that the New Republic protected from the Yevotha during the Black Fleet crisis. Black Sword Command's original headquarters, the military shipyard planet Praxis, was located in the adjacent Praxis sector, along with other shipyards and military facilities. The Corridon sector contained a highly active black hole known as the Kadaji Singularity, while the Vanal sector, one of the most remote territories of the New Republic, contained Polylus, the low-tech homeworld of the two-headed Troig. The rest of the negative regions consisted of the territories along the Namadii corridor, beginning in the core with the Krenher sector. This sector covered a branch of the Namadii corridor called the Hyab-Twith corridor, which ran between Twith in the northern dependencies and Hyab in the Negs. Hyab and Twith were at war with one another for thousands of years, from the formation of the Republic near to the start of the Old Sith Wars, but since their fighting was consigned to a small, minor hyperspace route, the neighbors were typically content to ignore them. But a few decades prior to the Great Sith Wars, the Nelori marauders of the neighboring Dakat took advantage of the weakened state of the two systems to begin preying on them both. They set up a base on Voon, and from there, they began harassing shipping throughout the region. But the Nelori marauders were utterly crushed by the Jedi, who destroyed their bases on Voon and Dakat. In the process, the Jedi also settled the war between Hyab and Twith, restoring peace in the region. Also just off the Namadii corridor in the core were Denevar, the headquarters of the Bounty Hunters Guild chapter House Paramexor, the Kill Colony Merakai, and Ord Dolsan, a former Republic ordnance/regional depot. Further afield, there was Ragoon 6, the lush homeworld of the leathery-skinned Ragoon, who refused to industrialize to preserve their homeworld's natural beauty. There was also the Kanchen sector, an isolated but heavily populated cluster that contained Davnar 2, home to a scaly, long-snouted sentient species, the agri-world Pakrik Minor and its twin planet Pakrik Major, and Zarfel, the homeworld of the near-human Zarfel. Zarfel was originally settled as an ancient human colony, but it was lost for many years before being rediscovered. It was acquired by Kuat Driveyards, which industrialized Zarfel, building sprawling factories that manufactured hyperdrives. KDY ran these factories without any regulatory oversight or concern for the environment or natives, and as a result, Zarfel was severely contaminated. It became a hot, heavily urbanized, and thoroughly poisoned world with an acidic and barely breathable atmosphere. The native Zarfel suffered extensive genetic damage, which left them disfigured and gave them difficulties breathing the purer air of non-poisoned planets. In the colonies, the Namadii corridor passed another string of Negs planets, including the worlds of the Venjaga system, the munitions manufacturing planet Jugga 2, and its neighbor Jugga 7. Past the Venjaga system, in the galaxy's Bakchu arm, was the Fakir sector, which mostly lay within the northern dependencies but had a few systems in the Negs. These included Vakar on the Shui Exchange hyperspace route, and Marist, a low-gravity jungle world home to the avian Marisi. Marist was also home to the Marist Trade and Science Academy, which offered higher education to underprivileged beings from across the galaxy. Not far from Vakar were the Olonir boundaries, a remote sector that contained Thruntin, a heavily terraformed world that hosted the Galactic Outdoor Survival School, where scouts from all over the galaxy were trained to survive in a variety of environments. Further from the Namadii corridor were the spaceport planet Drefon 4, as well as Lontar and Batarin, the homeworlds of two rival species. Lontar was the homeworld of the Lontar species, while Batarin was a forested planet home to the Blood Carvers, a gold-skinned, insect-like species known for its sculptors and assassins. The Blood Carvers largely kept to themselves, but during the final centuries of the Republic, the Lontars waged a genocidal war against them. The Senate intervened on the Blood Carvers' behalf, but it was too late to save most of the species, and the bulk of the remaining Blood Carvers ended up leaving Baturine. There were very few systems of note in the inner rim portion of the Negs. Closer to the Namadii corridor, there was the former Republic Ordnance/Regional Depot Meglamine, the Wildlife Preserve and former Ricardan stronghold Owaka Prime, and the 5th system, which contained asteroid fields that were the only known source of Opila lightsaber crystals. Further out were the remote but popular shadowport Risi and the remote jungle planet Selvaris, the latter of which was converted into a penal colony by the Yuuzhan Vong during their invasion of the galaxy. The Clone Wars almost completely ignored the Negs, as so much of galactic history had. Most of the Negs were under firm Republic control, while the rest were located in unclaimed space on the edge of the unknown regions. There were no separatist enclaves in or near the negative regions at any point in the conflict, and not a single battle of the war was fought here. But the Negs weren't completely unaffected by the war. The Republic still had forces in the region, and they had more to do than you might think. 3 of the Republic sector armies had territory in the Negs. The eastern and Corward portion of the region, including the Ag Circuit and the inner portion of the Metellos trade route, lay within the Coruscant Oversector, the domain of Azure Hammer Command, the 1st Sector Army. Azure Hammer's main focus was defending Coruscant and the Republic's other vital worlds, so its forces didn't do much in the Negs, but Azure Hammer did have some assets out west, among them the Aland Yards and Incom's R&D facilities on Fresia. A small strip of the Negs along the Namadii corridor, meanwhile, fell within the Amalia Oversector, the territory of the 7th Sector Army, Golden Nis Command. Golden Nis had no real assets in the Negs, but it did conduct secret scouting missions there, as well as in the unknown regions beyond. The 7th Army was also tasked with reinforcing the 5th and 6th Sector armies in the event of an attack from the unknown regions. The main sector army in the Negs was the 6th Negative Regions Army, also known as Black Sword Command, which we discussed earlier. While Black Sword was best known for the loss of its fleet to the Yevethar during the Galactic Civil War, the army actually dates back to the Clone Wars, when it was established as a reserve garrison covering the bulk of the negative regions. Black Sword patrolled the western part of the Negs from its headquarters on Praxis, and it was meant to act as a rear guard for the Republic, a bulwark against potential threats from the unknown regions. On top of this duty, Black Sword was tasked with militarizing the remote reaches of the Negs, transforming the region into a secure fallback base far from the front lines. Black Sword Command filled the Negs with training camps, secret shipyards and repair yards, which played a significant role in reinforcing and maintaining the rest of the Republic military. Some of the 6th Army remained in the Negs to oversee these operations and to stand guard against the unknown regions, but most of the units assigned to Black Sword were transferred to other theaters to serve as reinforcements for the more embattled armies. Now it's time to talk about the Deep Core, the innermost region of the Star Wars galaxy. The Deep Core was one of the most mysterious and forbidding parts of the galaxy, hard to navigate and full of secrets, some ancient and some modern. There were only a handful of known systems within it, and those systems were a mixed bag. A few were millennia-old Republic members with long histories, while others were more recent discoveries with their own native cultures. Some systems were ancient strongholds of the Jedi or Sith, and many were fortress worlds established by the Empire, which filled the deepest parts of the region. The Deep Core lacked a single unifying cultural identity. The more established parts of it were more or less extensions of the Arrowhead or Southern Core, and only the more recently established Imperial strongholds were culturally distinct, defined primarily by secrecy, militarization, and fanatical loyalty to the New Order, as well as, in some cases, the touch of the dark side. The Deep Core was the only region of the galaxies whose borders were defined not by cultural differences or exploration waves, but by mathematics. The outer border of the deep core, which was called the horizon, was the point past which navicomputer data had to be newer than a month old in order to be safely usable due to the density and high velocities of stars and other real space objects. The horizon formed a circle around the galactic center with a diameter of roughly 7,000 light years. The region within was extremely dense, packed with an estimated 30 billion stars, including many of the galaxy's oldest. These stars, together with nebulae, stellar remnants, dark matter concentrations, and other objects, were clustered around a supermassive black hole ringed with star clusters, antimatter pockets, and vast clouds of dust and gas. The sheer density of the deep core made it exceptionally difficult to navigate, and hyperspace travel was straight up impossible in some especially dense regions. Safe hyperspace routes were rare and hard to find, and since stars in the deep core orbited quickly around the galactic center, even the most reliable routes needed to be regularly remapped. In the depths of the region, new hyperspace data needed to be transmitted to passing ships on a daily basis. Even on the safest routes, a slight navigational error could be fatal, subjecting ships to hyperspace collisions or stranding them in a region where the density of mass shadows made hyperspace jumps impossible. It didn't help that there wasn't much in the deep core worth traveling to anyway. Life here was very rare, as stellar interactions and supernovae were frequent and destructive, destroying stars and planets alike or ejecting them from their orbits. As a consequence of all this, a majority of the deep core was completely unexplored. A small strip of the deep core, running from Coruscant to the Koros system, had been mapped since before the Republic, and this explored region slowly expanded outwards over the course of Republic history, ultimately extending down to Tython. Over the course of the Old Republic era, explorers charted a few more narrow regions on the very edge of the deep core, but only during the final centuries of the Republic, from 1000 BBY to the end of the Clone Wars, did explorers start making progress deeper into the region. The Empire explored the deep core further, but much of the region still remained unmapped by the time of the New Republic. There were only two major hyperspace routes in the deep core. The first was the Koros Trunk Line, an ancient route between Coruscant in the Arrowhead and the Koros system in the deep core. The Trunk Line predated the Republic, and it was the main entry point into the deep core, the corridor along which the region's few well-settled territories lay. Where the Koros Trunk Line ended, the deep core's second major hyperspace route, the Byss Run, began. The Byss Run struck out into the depths of the region, wrapping around the galaxy's heart on its way to distant Byss. The Byss Run made up the core section of the larger Nexus route, which was the only hyperspace route that went all the way through the deep core. General Grievous used this route for his surprise attack on Coruscant at the end of the Clone Wars, but after that, the parts of the route past Byss were probably erased by the dynamics of the deep core. Moving on, let's talk about the systems of the deep core, beginning with the worlds along the Koros Trunk Line. The Koros Trunk Line was one of the first hyperspace routes mapped after the invention of the modern hyperdrive, charted to connect the ancient colonies of the Koros system with Coruscant shortly before the formation of the Republic. Before the invention of the modern hyperdrive, the very first human generation ships had reached the Koros system along a similar path, and it was there that they discovered carbonite and carbon freezing, which was used on the sleeper ships humanity used to settle the core worlds. Even after the invention of the hyperdrive, the Koros system still shipped plenty of carbonite to Coruscant, and the Koros Trunk Line was blazed to facilitate this, earning it the nickname of the Carbonite Pipeline. Under natural conditions, the Koros Trunk Line would have been erased by the dynamics of the deep core long ago, but the Republic lined the route with S-thread boosters, which artificially kept the trunk line stable all throughout the Republic's history, allowing it to serve as the main route into the deep core, a backbone of Republic civilization. As it entered the deep core from the arrowhead, the Koros trunk line passed Jerelek, a tropical oceanic world littered with the ruins of a long-extinct civilization, before moving on into the Koros sector, the most densely populated part of the deep core. The Koros sector contained the planet Ronica, as well as the Koros system itself, more commonly known as the Empress Teta system. Ronica was a barren desert planet used as a penal colony by the Korosians, who intended to terraform the planet to habitability using prison labor. It was one of the few colonies in the Koros sector which were all ruled from the Empress Teta system, historically known as the Koros system, and less commonly as simply the Teta system, the endpoint of the Koros trunk line. The Empress Teta system contained a staggering 7 habitable terrestrial planets home to ancient human colonies. These were, in order of increasing distance from the Sun, Gilad, Mozos, Empress Teta, Triast, Phiris, Phoros, and Kirek. Further out, there was also the frozen rock Keres II, which featured a few carbonite mining outposts. The 7 worlds each had their own distinct cultures, although they all had certain core traits in common, and most of them were economically powerful in one way or another. Empress Teta itself was the heart of the system. Formerly known as Koros Major, Empress Teta was a heavily urbanized planet. It had a few regions of open country, but its continents were largely covered by cities. The most notable of these was the capital of Sinagar, which covered more than half of the planet's landmasses, for which reason the whole planet was sometimes referred to as Sinagar. Empress Teta was a wealthy and well-developed world, more suited to the arrowhead than the deep core. The planet's wealth originally stemmed from its rich deposits of carbonite and andric spice, which the Tetans had mined and exported since before the Republic. The Tetans also controlled similar mining operations on the other Koros system worlds. For this reason, Empress Teta was one of the first strongholds of the mining guild, which was partly formed from Koros system mining interests, and in the modern era, it hosted a major headquarters of the guild. Empress Teta and the rest of the Koros system were ostensibly an absolute monarchy ruled by the ancient Tetan aristocracy, but in practice, the barons of the mining guild ran the show, with the nobles content to sit back and take their cut of the profits. Empress Teta had a single moon, Atale, where the mining guild had the system's main androus spice production facilities, and the Empress Teta system was also littered with both military and civilian shipyards, orbital defense platforms, and carbonite smelting space stations. The worlds of the Koros system were settled sometime before 27,500 BBY, and they all became boom worlds of the early Republic, power players in the galactic economy. For 20,000 years, the 7 worlds were independent and occasionally fought wars against one another, but they were united under the rule of Empress Teta, the monarch of Koros Major, in 5000 BBY after the decade-long Unification Wars. That same year, a short-lived hyperspace route known as the Daragon Trail connected the system to Korriban, which was the Sith's main avenue of attack in the Great Hyperspace War, which involved a major battle in the Koros system. After Empress Teta's death, Koros Major and the whole Koros system were renamed after her, and the 7 worlds remained united and prosperous. During the Great Sith War, a Sith cult known as the Krath briefly seized power in the system, converting it into a Sith stronghold, but they were purged once the war ended. By the modern era, Empress Teta had long since recovered, and it remained extremely wealthy despite rampant corruption issues. During the Clone Wars, Empress Teta and the rest of the Koros sector supported the Separatists due to pressure from the mining guild, but this support was half-hearted, and many Tetan nobles remained loyal to the Republic. Within the Tetan sphere of influence, there were a few other objects of note just off the Koros trunk line. One was the planet Kuar, a barren world of dusty plains whose original inhabitants were wiped out by the Mandalorian Crusaders, who briefly used Kuar as their forward headquarters for raids on the Koros system. On the other side of the trunk line was the Star Swarm Cluster, a dense cluster of young stars, and the unstable red supergiant Primus Golud. Primus Golud was once located on the Daragon Trail, and it was the site of a major battle of the Great Hyperspace War. During the Imperial period, it lay along the Carbonite Run, a smuggler's route between the Deep Core and the Core worlds. The Carbonite Run ran from Primus Golud into the northeastern corner of the Deep Core, which contained a handful of noteworthy systems. These included Dremule, a resort planet, Adana, the homeworld of the Forced, and Bessero, a mining world rich in Lumni spice, which the Empire transformed into a penal colony. The lost world, Had Abaddon, was rumored to have been home to an ancient sect of Force sensitives, while Volpta, the smog-choked homeworld of the shovel-mouth Volptarines, was a major industrial world. Volpta was completely covered by factories and urban zones, and it was heavily polluted, littered with junkyards and sporting several rings of orbital trash. It primarily manufactured starships and pod racer components, and it was once home to the headquarters of the Trade Federation, which was partly responsible for the wholesale destruction of Volpta's ecosystem. The eastern fringe of the Deep Core contained a few more noteworthy systems, many close to the edge of the Arrowhead. These included Ebark 9, a moon that hosted a bronzium mining operation under the Empire, the hidden Imperial Fortress world Tarkin's Fang, Kosia, the homeworld of the Kosians, Stujon, the birthplace of Obi-Wan Kenobi, Hakasi, the capital of an Imperial warlord state, and Eclipse, a hidden safe world of the new Jedi Order. There was also Ojom, a frigid ocean world home to the Basilisks, who lived in anarchistic communes on the surface, while outsiders generally kept to the planet's orbital space stations. The southern portion of the Deep Core was home to a few sentient species, including the Constantians of the ring planet Constantia, the unnamed natives of Christian 5, and the Comites of Com. Com was a pleasant but almost maddeningly dull planet, as the Comites insisted on keeping absolutely everything perfectly ordered and static. After determining that their society had peaked circa 990 BBY, the Comites had devoted their society to keeping everything the same, to the point where they began reproducing only via cloning. All Comites were clones of someone from an earlier generation, and they each lived exactly as their predecessor had. Com was extremely insular, but it was still affiliated with the Galactic Republic, which granted it exemptions to the regulations on cloning passed during the Clone Wars. The Imperial Warlord State, Zero Command, maintained several deep space shipyards in the southern Deep Core, including Deep 3, and it also controlled Kallist 6, a desert planet where the Empire built a major penal colony. The innermost depths of the Deep Core were the hardest to navigate, full of dense star clusters and other hazards whirling around Galactic Center, the supermassive black hole at the heart of it all. But there were a few known worlds in this hard-to-reach region, most notably Tython, the birthplace of the Jedi Order. In the pre-Republic era, the worlds of the Tython system, Sunspot, Maltera, Nox, Krev, Koa, Tython, Kalimar, Shikakwa, the moons of the gas giants Aubrey and Mara, and Fury's Gate, were all thickly settled. Tython was settled by Force sensitives, and the others were settled by their non-Force sensitive descendants. Tython was once a lush world that was strongly attuned to the Force, and for 10,000 years, it was home to the Jedi Order, the Jedi Order's predecessors. The Jedi began the study of the Force and its two sides, which they named Ashla and Bogan after Tython's moons. But Tython was devastated in the Force Wars, fought between the followers of the Ashla and those of the Bogan, and the Jedi Order, which formed from the triumphant followers of Ashla, abandoned the planet. Tython was later devastated during the new Sith Wars, transformed into a stormy wasteland of barren ash plains. The Sith Lord, Belia Darzu, had a fortress on Tython late in the period, and after her defeat, the planet was abandoned for good. The inner deep core also contained the hot and largely uninhabitable planet Aloxil, the site of a small Jedi enclave, as well as Camp, the arid stronghold of Imperial warlord Sandar Delvadis. Closer to Galactic Center was Tassos Beacon, an asteroid that hosted a minor Imperial communications outpost where Admiral Natasi Dallar executed the 13 leading Imperial warlords in 12 ABY. The deepest known world within the deep core was the Wellspring of Life, a legendary, dreamlike planet that was supposedly the birthplace of the midichlorians. West of the innermost deep core were some of the most heavily guarded systems in the region, the worlds of the Byss Run, the deep core's second major hyperspace route. Originally charted during the Clone Wars, the Byss Run was stabilized with S-thread boosters under the Empire, which established a number of secret colonies along its length. There were 3 notable systems along this route, the first of which contained the planet Prakith. Prakith was a rugged, largely desolate volcanic world dotted with mines owed by the Mining Guild. During the time of the Old Sith Empire, Prakith was the stronghold of Darth Anderu, who was revered by local cults as the immortal god king of Prakith for millennia after his death. Prakith became a Republic fortress world during the Clone Wars, and under the Empire, it became home to the Citadel Inquisitorius, the headquarters of the Imperial High Inquisitors. Past Prakith, the Byss Run passed Odic II, a prison world and military stronghold, and from there it went on to the Beshkek system, the terminus of the route, home to the habitable planets Raelus and Byss. Raelus was a fairly minor colony world, but Byss was the secret throne world of the Empire, Darth Sidious's hidden redoubt. To the casual observer, Byss at first appeared to be a paradise, covered by serene seas and rolling plains of ferns and lichens, kept eternally temperate due to its negligible axial tilt. The light of Byss's blue sun gave it an eerie blue-green glow from orbit, only adding to its natural beauty. But while Byss appeared beautiful, in truth, it was a tainted world, an incredibly strong nexus of the dark side. This wasn't originally the case, despite the fact that the Infinite Empire had once set up shop on Byss. Back then, Byss was just a powerful conduit of the Force, unaligned with the light or the dark. But it had been corrupted by Darth Sidious, who, after becoming Emperor, had a whole continent on Byss converted into a grand royal city, the true capital of the Empire, built around the Imperial Citadel, Sidious's private retreat and stronghold. The Emperor lured billions of colonists to settle this city, drawn from among his most loyal subjects, and once on Byss, these colonists lived fairly luxurious lives, tended by the armies of slaves the Empire had used to build the colony. But all the while, Sidious slowly drained the life forces of everyone on the planet, using them for terrible dark side experiments. The use of such techniques on such a massive scale corrupted the Force Nexus at Byss, immersing the planet in the dark side. In orbit, Byss hosted sprawling military shipyards, a massive defense fleet, and the Galaxy Gun, a superweapon capable of destroying planets from across the galaxy. After Sidious's death in the Battle of Endor, his spirit was reborn in a clone body on Byss, from which he began Operation Shadowhand, his campaign to reconquer the galaxy. Byss became the heart of his Dark Empire, but it was destroyed at around the same time of Sidious's final defeat, obliterated by the Galaxy Gun's last shot. Similar to the Negs, the Deep Core was largely unaffected by the Clone Wars. While the Chorus sector supported the Separatists, it remained under Republic control, as did the entirety of the Deep Core. There were no battles in the Deep Core, and though General Grievous led a fleet through the region along the Nexus route in order to attack Coruscant toward the end of the conflict, the fleet remained in hyperspace all the way through the region. Nonetheless, the Republic had forces in the Deep Core, some of which were there for sinister purposes. The Koros trunk line and a small region of space around it were part of the Coruscant Oversector and patrolled by Azure Hammer Command, which kept the Separatists in the Koros sector in check. But the rest of the Deep Core was its own Oversector, patrolled by the 5th Deep Core Army, Shadow Hand Command. Like Black Sword Command, Shadow Hand was a reserve sector army, and the bulk of its forces were transferred to other theaters to reinforce other parts of the GAR. Only a skeleton force remained behind, headquartered on Odic II, and this force spent the Clone Wars laying the foundation for what would become the Empire's Dark Heart. During the war, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine secretly dispatched thousands of probe droids into the Deep Core to find workable hyperspace routes, and after becoming Emperor, he formalized some of these routes and established secret colonies along them, most notably Byss. After the rise of the Empire, the entire Deep Core became a security zone. The planets within were seized by the Empire, most notably including the worlds of the Empress Theta system, which had their mines nationalized and which were subjected to blockades. Only a privileged few were allowed to pass the 5th Army fleets that now guarded the ways in and out of the Deep Core, and those that did were closely watched. After the Battle of Endor, the Deep Core remained an Imperial stronghold, full of the Emperor's secret fleets and dozens of hidden shipyards, fortress worlds, and staging areas. As the Imperial warlords were defeated by the New Republic, many of them fled to the Deep Core, where they established rump states and wasted their strength in petty wars with one another. The most notable of the Deep Core warlord states were Zero Command, ruled by Lord High Admiral Blitzer Hask from Callist 4, the Federated Pterodok Union, ruled by High Admiral Trayton Pterodok from Hakasi, the Ariado Authority, ruled by Superior General Sandar Delvadus from Camp, and the Constitutional Protectorate of Prakith, ruled by Moff Foga Brill from Prakith. These warlords came out of hiding to serve the Dark Empire, taking part in Operation Shadowhand, but after the destruction of Byss, they returned to their old squabbles. The warlords were ultimately wiped out by Natasi Dala at Tassos Beacon, following which she led their fleets out of the Deep Core, emptying what was once the Empire's Dark Heart. So that brings us to the end of our tours of the Deep Core and the Negs. We hope you've enjoyed this glimpse into these little-known regions of the galaxy. But what do you think? Do you like these sorts of videos? Which do you find more interesting, the Deep Core or the Negs? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.